It was a crisp autumn morning when Maya Walker woke up to an ordinary day, or at least she thought it would be. The city streets outside her modest apartment were already bustling with activity. Maya had always found comfort in the hum of the city, the sounds of people rushing by, the buzz of cars and bicycles, the warmth of the sun that filtered through the tall buildings. She was a woman of simple routines: her small apartment, her 9-to-5 job at a local bookstore, and weekends spent volunteering at the community center. To anyone who looked at her, she was just another face in the crowd, blending in with the thousands of other working-class citizens trying to make ends meet. But Maya wasn't like everyone else. She had a secret, a past she'd spent years hiding, a secret that no one in this city knew about. Her life wasn't always so quiet. Once, Maya had been part of a family that stood out in the public eye, a name that carried weight in circles she had long distanced herself from. But years of painful memories, coupled with a burning desire to forge her own path without the shadow of her family, had led her to leave that world behind. She had reinvented herself. Maya Walker was no longer the woman she had been, no longer the daughter of a well-known business magnate whose family had long dominated the local politics. She had erased all traces of that life, severed ties with the people who once called her a future leader, and moved to a quiet corner of the city to live anonymously. In this world, she was just another black woman, trying to survive and be accepted, hoping to make a difference in her own way. That morning, like every other, Maya had walked to the coffee shop down the street. She smiled as she passed the familiar faces of the baristas and customers who greeted her by name. It was a simple pleasure, one that kept her grounded. She exchanged a few words with the coffee shop owner, Tom, a middle-aged man with a warm smile who always seemed to know exactly what she needed to start her day. She grabbed her usual black coffee, no sugar, and made her way to the bookstore where she worked. There, in the cramped back office, surrounded by piles of unsorted books, Maya was in her element. She loved the scent of paper, the rustling of pages, and the quiet rhythm of the store during the morning hours. But as the day wore on, things began to take an unexpected turn. It started with a phone call, the kind of call that changes everything. Maya's heart sank when the unfamiliar number flashed on her screen. The voice on the other end was tense, urgent. Maya Walker. Yes, speaking. Who is this? It's Officer Reynolds with the local police department. We need you to come down to the station immediately. There's been an incident. Her stomach twisted. What happened? I can't go into details over the phone, but we need your cooperation. It's about something you've been involved in. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She knew there had been no criminal activity in her life, not for years, and certainly not since she'd left her old life behind. But something about the tone in the officer's voice sent a chill down her spine. I'll be there in an hour, Maya replied, her voice shaky but resolute. She hung up, her mind racing. As much as she tried to remain calm, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. She knew that in the world she now lived, a black woman like her could easily be targeted by the system. And though she had done nothing wrong, the mere accusation could be enough to derail everything she had worked so hard to build. Arriving at the police station, Maya was met with an unsettling silence. The officers ushered her into a small interrogation room, where a stern-looking detective sat behind a desk, flanked by another officer. They didn't immediately explain the reason for her presence. Instead, they asked a barrage of questions, all about her whereabouts, her job, and her personal life. Maya answered each one as calmly as she could, trying to maintain her composure. But deep down, she was already starting to feel the weight of something larger than herself closing in. It wasn't until they showed her a mugshot of a woman she barely recognized that the full extent of the situation started to sink in. The woman in the photo was a suspect in a robbery that had occurred just days ago, and for reasons unknown to Maya, her name had somehow come up in the investigation. The officers were polite, but their questions began to feel like an accusation. their eyes scanning her face for any sign of guilt. "Are you sure you've never met this woman?" one of the officers asked, his tone implying doubt. "I've never seen her before in my life," Maya replied firmly, her pulse quickening. "I don't know anything about this robbery. I swear." Still, something about the situation felt off. Maya couldn't help but feel that this wasn't just a coincidence. The detectives seemed to be scrutinizing her every word, as though they were already convinced of her guilt. The hours stretched on, and Maya began to feel more trapped by the second. She tried calling her lawyer, but the calls went unanswered. Her mind raced through possibilities, wondering who could have possibly implicated her in such a crime. As the hours ticked by, Maya was told that the case would soon be brought before the judge. They hadn't yet formally charged her with anything, but they would need her to attend a preliminary hearing in the morning. That's when things took a darker turn. She was informed that the judge assigned to her case was none other than Judge Harold Montgomery, a man with a reputation for being tough and unforgiving. Maya had heard of him. He was known for his no-nonsense approach and his seemingly unwavering belief in justice, but she also knew that in his eyes, her race could easily become a liability. The thought of facing him made her stomach twist with anxiety. The next morning, Maya found herself standing in the courtroom, a sea of unfamiliar faces surrounding her. The judge entered, his expression stern as he surveyed the room. He was a tall man in his 60s, with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to see through everyone. Maya felt small under his gaze. She was about to become another statistic in a system that had never truly been fair to people like her. And as the trial began, the air in the room grew thick with tension. The prosecutor's arguments were full of emotion and accusations, painting Maya as guilty before the trial had even begun. She felt her heart race as the jury, some of them clearly skeptical, watched her every move. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with slicked back hair, made no attempt to hide his belief in Maya's guilt. He spoke in loud, accusatory tones, emphasizing her race and the supposed connection to the robbery. Maya tried to stay calm, but it was hard to ignore the feeling that this was a setup, a story that was being written without her consent. The judge, Judge Montgomery, had yet to speak, his silence adding to the weight of the situation. He looked at her with a cold gaze, and Maya could already sense that he had made up his mind about her. She wasn't just another defendant to him. She was a black woman in a system designed to keep people like her down. And for a moment, she wondered if anyone would ever believe her truth. The trial continued, and with every passing minute, Maya could feel the walls of the courtroom closing in on her. The prosecutor's words became a blur of accusations, none of which felt grounded in reality. He was relentless in his portrayal of her, making assumptions based on little more than her appearance. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice rising with each word, "this woman was seen near the scene of the robbery, and though she claims innocence, there is a clear connection between her and the suspect." The words stung, especially because Maya knew they were based on nothing but guesswork. She had never been near the crime scene. She had never even been to that part of the city. Yet here she was, accused of something she didn't do, fighting to clear her name in a system that seemed intent on convicting her based on the color of her skin. The prosecutor's case was weak at best, filled with circumstantial evidence and wild conjecture. But he played on the emotions of the jury, emphasizing Maya's background, implying that she was somehow part of a criminal underworld. Her stomach churned as she sat there, feeling the weight of his words on her shoulders. She had never been involved in any criminal activity in her life. She worked at a bookstore, spent her weekends volunteering at the community center, and did everything she could to stay out of trouble. Yet the mere suggestion that she could be capable of such a thing felt like a dagger to her heart. Throughout the prosecutor's tirade, Judge Harold Montgomery remained quiet, his eyes fixed on the proceedings. Maya couldn't help but notice the coldness in his gaze. There was no warmth, no empathy, only an air of indifference that sent a chill down her spine. She had heard rumors about Montgomery, that he was a man who ruled with an iron fist, a man who had little tolerance for excuses, especially when it came to those who didn't fit the mold of what he deemed respectable. She had always believed that the law was meant to be blind to race, but sitting here, in this courtroom, facing this judge, she began to wonder if that was ever truly the case. The defense lawyer, a young man named Michael Davis, was doing his best to refute the accusations. He spoke in measured tones, presenting the facts and attempting to undermine the prosecutor's flimsy case. "Your Honor, there is no concrete evidence linking my client to this alleged crime," he argued. "No fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, and certainly no motive. This is a case built on assumptions and prejudice, not on facts." But the words didn't seem to have the impact they should have. Maya could see the jury shifting in their seats, some of them eyeing her with suspicion, others with outright disdain. She could almost feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on her, suffocating her every word and action. She tried to remain calm, tried to focus on the evidence, but her mind kept drifting back to the moment when she was first brought into the police station. What had she missed? Who had pointed the finger at her? And why? As the trial wore on, Maya's sense of unease only grew. The prosecutor had finished his case, and now it was time for the defense to make its final arguments. Michael Davis did his best to dismantle the accusations, but every time he spoke, it felt like a battle against an invisible force, an unspoken bias that hung in the air like a fog, clouding every aspect of the case. Maya knew that her only hope was for the jury to see through the layers of prejudice and recognize that she was innocent. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that the system wasn't interested in finding the truth. It was more interested in maintaining the status quo. As the day wore on, Maya's anxiety reached its peak. The judge had yet to speak a word in her defense. He had not acknowledged the holes in the prosecution's case, nor had he shown any sign that he was even considering the possibility of her innocence. Instead, his gaze remained cold and unyielding, focused solely on the proceedings as though he had already made up his mind. Maya's heart sank as she realized that this trial was not about truth. It was about power. It was about who held the control, who could manipulate the narrative, and who was willing to fight for what was right. It wasn't until the closing arguments that the first hint of hope appeared. Michael Davis stood before the jury, his voice calm but resolute. "We ask you to look beyond the stereotypes and assumptions. We ask you to look at the facts, to see the woman standing before you not as a criminal, but as a human being who deserves justice. There is no evidence to convict her, no reason to believe she is guilty of this crime. We ask you to find her not guilty. Not because it's easy, but because it's right." Maya felt a small flicker of hope. She had heard those words many times before, but they had never felt as powerful as they did now. She could only pray that the jury would listen, that they would see her for who she truly was. A woman caught in a system that didn't understand her, that didn't care to understand her. She wasn't a criminal. She was a survivor. A woman who had been forced to navigate a world that constantly tried to push her down. And now she was fighting for her future. But as the jury left the room to deliberate, Maya couldn't shake the nagging feeling that things weren't as simple as they seemed. There was something about Judge Montgomery's demeanor, something about the way he had scrutinized every word that had been spoken, that made her question whether she could truly count on him to be fair. She had heard stories of judges like him. Judges who believed that the law was an infallible system, but who failed to see the cracks in the system that kept people like her from receiving justice. The minutes stretched into hours as Maya waited in the courtroom, her heart pounding with anticipation. She had no idea what the verdict would be, but she knew that whatever happened, it would change her life forever. She couldn't help but think of her old life, the life she had left behind when she moved to this city. She had escaped the constraints of her family's legacy, but now here she was again, caught in the web of a world that didn't want to see her succeed. Would she be able to break free once more, or would she be swallowed whole by a system that was never designed to protect her? And then the door to the courtroom opened, and the jury filed in, their faces unreadable. Maya stood tall, but her legs felt weak beneath her. This was it. This was the moment that would define her future, and there was nothing she could do but wait for the judge to speak. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Montgomery took his seat once again. His gaze swept across the room, briefly lingering on Maya before moving to the jury. His eyes were unreadable, giving nothing away as the tension in the air grew thicker. The jury had returned, and now the waiting game was almost over. Maya's heart raced in her chest as she stood there, trying to steady her breathing, trying not to show the nervous tremor in her hands. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, suffocating her with the fear of what might come next. She had done everything she could to prove her innocence, to show them that she was not the person they had painted her to be. But now it was in their hands. The judge, who had been silent throughout most of the trial, finally spoke, his deep voice cutting through the thick atmosphere. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" he asked, his tone as cold and distant as ever. A foreboding hush swept through the room as the foreman of the jury stood. He glanced nervously at Maya before turning toward the judge. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman said, his voice low and hesitant. Maya's throat tightened. She couldn't breathe. She didn't know what she was expecting, but whatever it was, she wasn't prepared for what was about to unfold. The room seemed to spin as the foreman began to read aloud the verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Maya Walker, guilty of all charges." The words hit her like a physical blow. And for a moment, the entire world went silent. Maya's vision blurred as she stared at the foreman, unable to process what she had just heard. Her body went numb, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She had been convicted. Despite everything, despite the lack of solid evidence, despite her own defense, despite the truth that she had never committed the crime, she was guilty in the eyes of the court. The gravity of the moment weighed on her, crushing her spirit. She tried to make sense of it, but it was impossible. The courtroom felt like it was closing in around her, the walls narrowing, and the voices of the people fading into a distant hum. Judge Montgomery didn't look up at her. His eyes were fixed on the jury, his expression unwavering. He gave a slight nod, signaling for the officers to take her into custody. The sound of chains clinking together was deafening as the bailiffs moved toward Maya. She could barely breathe, her mind reeling, and her heart heavy with disbelief. She had prepared for this possibility, but to hear the words spoken aloud, to feel the weight of that verdict, it shattered her in ways she couldn't describe. As the bailiffs moved to restrain her, a voice broke through the fog in her mind. It was Michael Davis, her defense attorney, shouting for the judge's attention. "Your Honor, we have reason to believe there's been a mistake," Davis said, rushing to stand in front of the judge. "The jury has reached this verdict based on flawed reasoning. We ask for a mistrial." Judge Montgomery finally raised his eyes to the defense attorney, his expression still as hard as stone. For a moment, it seemed as though he was considering the request. But his next words were like a hammer, final and unyielding. "Denied," he said sharply. "The jury has spoken. The verdict stands." Maya's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to protest, to demand that they listen, but the words wouldn't come. She was trapped in the crushing reality of the situation. She had been found guilty. The bailiffs gently but firmly took hold of her arms, and with no further words spoken, they led her out of the courtroom. She didn't look back. As she walked down the cold, sterile hallway, the sound of her footsteps echoing off the walls, 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. How had this happened? How had the system failed her so completely? Was this the justice she had worked so hard to believe in? Was this the system that was supposed to protect her? As they placed her into the holding cell, Maya collapsed onto the bench, her body trembling. She was alone now, and the full weight of her situation hit her. She had never felt more powerless in her life. The reality of the world she lived in was crueler than she had ever imagined. It didn't matter what she had done or who she was. In the eyes of the law, she was guilty, and nothing would change that. But just as the despair began to wash over her, something strange happened. A woman's voice pierced the darkness of the cell, a voice Maya didn't recognize but one that seemed familiar nonetheless. Maya Walker. Maya's hands clenched into fists as she leaned forward, her voice shaky but determined. "Tell me who you are. Why should I trust you?" The woman didn't flinch. "I'm someone who's spent years working to uncover the corruption running through this city. I know things that no one else does. And I know the truth about what's happening in this courthouse. It's not just about you, Maya. You're part of something much bigger. A conspiracy that's been running for decades, and it's only now that they're starting to close in on you." Maya's chest tightened as her mind struggled to absorb the enormity of what the woman was saying. Corruption. A conspiracy. It sounded impossible. How could she, an ordinary woman who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, be connected to something so vast and sinister? But the more she thought about it, the more pieces started to fall into place. The way the prosecutor had so quickly attacked her, the way the judge had barely seemed to notice the lack of evidence, something didn't add up. It wasn't just about the crime she was accused of. It was about something else, something deeper. "I still don't understand," Maya whispered, her voice trembling. "What does this all mean? What does any of this have to do with me?" The woman sighed, the sadness in her eyes reflecting a lifetime of secrets. "It means you're in more danger than you realize. This isn't just about proving your innocence. It's about exposing the system that's been rigged against people like you for generations. The judge, the prosecutor, they're all part of a network that has been manipulating the justice system. They've been using their power to control who gets punished and who gets away. And now you've become a pawn in their game." Maya's stomach churned. She had always believed in justice, in the idea that the truth would eventually come to light, that the innocent would be protected. But now, with this woman's words hanging in the air, she realized how naive she had been. The system wasn't built to protect her. It was built to protect those in power, to maintain the status quo, and keep people like her down. But who was behind this? Who could pull the strings to control the decisions of a judge, a prosecutor, a jury? "I don't even know where to start," Maya murmured, the weight of everything crashing down on her. "What do you want me to do? How can I fix this?" The woman's eyes softened for a moment. "You're not alone in this. There are others who are fighting for the same thing. But you're the key. The judge, he's the weak link. If you can expose him, the whole system will start to unravel. You've been set up as the scapegoat, Maya. They needed someone to take the fall, and now you have the chance to turn the tables. But it's going to take everything you've got. And it's going to be dangerous." Maya's mind was reeling. A part of her wanted to run, to leave it all behind and never look back. But deep down, she knew she couldn't. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about something much larger, something that affected everyone who had ever been overlooked or mistreated by the system. If she could expose the truth, if she could prove her innocence, and take down those who had tried to destroy her, she could help change the world. And though it terrified her, the idea of standing up for what was right filled her with a sense of purpose she had never known before. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady now, her resolve hardening. "I'll take down Montgomery. I'll expose everything. I won't be their scapegoat." The woman nodded, a glimmer of approval in her eyes. "Good. But be careful. There are people watching you. People who will stop at nothing to keep their secrets safe. And once you start digging, there's no going back." With those final words, the woman turned and walked out of the holding cell, leaving Maya alone in the silence. The weight of her decision hung in the air, a constant presence that would guide her every move from here on out. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let herself be a pawn anymore. She was going to fight for the truth, no matter what it took. The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and betrayal, but Maya was ready. The time for silence was over. It was time to expose the lies. It was time to reclaim her life and take down those who had tried to destroy her. She wasn't going to back down. Not anymore. Maya's mind raced as she sat alone in the holding cell, the woman's words echoing in her head. She had made a choice, but the weight of that decision began to sink in. The path ahead was anything but clear. The world outside the cold walls of the courthouse was as uncertain as it had ever been. But one thing was now certain. She was no longer just fighting for her freedom. She was fighting for the truth, for justice, and for a system that had failed so many like her. The conspiracy that the woman had mentioned, those behind the scenes pulling the strings, was far bigger than she had ever imagined. Judge Montgomery, the prosecutor, and those in positions of power who had dismissed her case, they were all part of something darker. She was caught in a web of corruption that stretched far beyond her own trial. The realization sent a chill through her bones. What had started as a seemingly straightforward case of being falsely accused of a crime had grown into something much more dangerous. Maya's mind had only begun to grasp the scale of the system she was now up against. She had been a victim of it, but now she had a chance to break free. No longer was she just the woman who had been wrongly convicted. She had become a symbol of defiance, of resistance against those who abused their power for personal gain. But that symbol came with a heavy price. Maya couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As she sat in the cell, the eyes of unseen forces seemed to be pressing in on her, waiting for her next move. She knew the risk she was taking. If she went forward with the plan to expose the judge and the conspiracy, there would be no turning back. There were too many people who stood to lose everything if the truth came to light. The stakes were higher than she had ever imagined. When the door to the holding cell finally opened, a rush of cold air swept through the room, and a guard stepped inside, signaling that it was time. Maya's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just any guard. It was a man she recognized. His name was Officer Garrett, and he had been one of the officers who had escorted her to the police station the night her case had begun. She had always felt that something about him seemed out of place, a look of knowing in his eyes, something that suggested he wasn't entirely on the side of the law. "Time to go," Officer Garrett said, his voice low, and there was an odd tone to it. Maya couldn't quite place it, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was more than just an officer following orders. Maya stood, but her body felt heavy, weighed down by everything she was about to undertake. She followed Garrett down the hallway, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The further they went, the more she felt like a pawn in a much larger game. But with every step she took, her resolve hardened. This was bigger than her, but it was also something she had to do, for herself and for everyone who had ever been silenced by the system. When they reached the exit, Garrett stopped. "Listen, Maya, I don't know if you're aware of everything going on, but I've been following your case. I know you're innocent, and I'm not blind to what's happening behind the scenes. Just be careful," he said, glancing around as if to make sure no one was watching. Maya's breath caught. She had suspected that someone might be on her side, but hearing it from him, hearing the urgency in his voice, made her wonder just how deep this conspiracy went. Officer Garrett's words confirmed something she had feared. She wasn't alone in this fight. But that didn't make things any easier. It meant that there were others involved, people who had either chosen to ignore the truth or had been swept up in the system themselves. "Who else knows?" Maya asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Garrett shook his head, his expression grim. "I can't say too much, but you're not the only one who's been silenced. There's a small group of us who are aware of the corruption. We've been trying to gather evidence for years, but it's like fighting a shadow. The people you're up against, they're connected. They'll do whatever it takes to keep things quiet." Maya's mind raced. She was already in too deep. But now she knew she couldn't stop. Not now. The pieces were falling into place, and she could see the larger picture. What had started as a personal fight for her freedom had turned into a battle for something bigger, a chance to expose the rot in the very system that was supposed to protect her. "You need to be smart about this," Garrett continued, his voice low. "The judge, Montgomery, He's more than just a puppet. He's got his hands in more than one dirty deal. People trust him because they don't see what's going on behind closed doors. But if you go public, if you start making waves, they'll come after you. They'll stop at nothing to make sure you stay quiet. So be careful who you trust. Watch your back. Maya nodded, the reality of what she was about to do settling deep into her bones. She had known this wasn't going to be easy. But hearing Garrett's words only solidified the truth she had been avoiding. This was dangerous. There would be no protection, no guarantee of success. If she went forward, she was stepping into a war that she wasn't sure she could win. But for the first time in a long time, Maya felt a surge of power. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She wasn't going to let the system break her. She was going to break it. "Thank you," Maya said, her voice steadier now. "I won't forget this." Officer Garrett didn't answer immediately. He just gave her a brief, knowing nod before turning and walking away, disappearing into the shadows of the courthouse. Maya stood in the hallway for a long moment, her thoughts a whirlwind. She didn't know who she could trust, who was on her side, or who might be working for the other side. But one thing was certain. She wasn't going to be a victim of the system anymore. She was going to expose the truth. She would be the one to take down the corrupt powers that had controlled her life for far too long. As Maya left the courthouse and stepped out into the cool evening air, she looked up at the skyline. The city had always seemed so ordinary to her, just a place to survive, a place to disappear. But now it felt like a battleground, a place where her fight for freedom and justice was just beginning. The shadows that had once hidden her past now loomed over her future. But Maya wasn't afraid anymore. She was ready for whatever came next. It was time to expose the truth, no matter the cost. The city would never be the same again, and neither would she. The next few days passed in a blur, each moment filled with uncertainty and anticipation. Maya couldn't shake the feeling that every move she made was being watched, that every step she took was leading her deeper into a web of deception and danger. But she knew she couldn't turn back. She had made her decision, and now it was time to act. If she was going to expose the corruption in the system, she had to move fast and with precision. The longer she stayed quiet, the more she allowed the forces against her to tighten their grip. Maya had learned quickly that the power of the system wasn't just in the people who ran it. It was in the secrecy, the silence, and the unspoken rules that governed everything behind the scenes. But now, with the help of Officer Garrett and others who had quietly stood by her, she knew she had a chance. She wasn't alone. And in that realization, a new sense of resolve took root in her. This wasn't just about clearing her name anymore. It was about taking down those who had manipulated the law for their own gain. It was about reclaiming her life, and in doing so, giving others like her the courage to do the same. She spent the next few days laying the groundwork. Garrett had given her a few leads, a few people she could trust. It wasn't easy to find allies in a system so entrenched in corruption, but Maya knew she had to. The people at the heart of this conspiracy, the judge, the prosecutor, the ones pulling the strings, would never expect someone like her to rise up against them. They had underestimated her, assuming she would quietly accept her fate, be swallowed by the machine that had wronged her. But they hadn't counted on her fight. The first step was to gather information. Garrett had told her about a key piece of evidence hidden deep within the courthouse records, a document that could tie Judge Montgomery to a series of shady deals and illegal activities. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Maya couldn't rely on traditional means. Her lawyer was still unsure of the full scope of the case, and the authorities were compromised. So she did what she had learned to do best over the years: fly under the radar and dig deep. The courthouse was a labyrinth of paperwork, old files, and court transcripts that could easily be overlooked. But Maya wasn't here to get lost. She knew the system, she knew the people who ran it, and she understood the importance of being thorough.